Daddy, can you teach me how to make 3D?
So I've been making art most of my life. Started off with making silly videos when I was a kid, that moved into music production, then eventually photography, video, which led to motion graphic design, then eventually 3D. If I look back at my work, I can always see clear level up moments. I had one at the beginning of 2024, one back in 2021, and it usually just starts with reworking some old projects or wanting to learn something new to incorporate into my workflow, and during that process something just kind of clicks and unlocks. The last few months I've really been working on solidifying my 3D pipeline, creating different pieces, doing the same process over and over again until I don't really have to think about the technical side of things and live more in a creative space where my mind can just be free and create whatever my imagination provides. Back when I was learning music production, I heard a music producer say that when you get a new piece of gear, that you should experiment with it, go into every menu, click every button, turn every knob, and see what it can do. This thought's been living in my head a lot recently when it comes to my 3D process, trying to figure out new ways of doing things, reading, learning, and experimenting. So when I'm trying to solve a problem or create something in a specific way, I can think of 3 or 4 ways to accomplish that. I really do feel that if you're intentional about learning and dedicated to your creative practice, that you can really level up your art faster than you ever thought you could. For this project, I first started off with an old sculpt of Ren that I did a couple years ago. Since I already had the basic shapes from the sculpt created, I thought it would be faster if I just started from there. So in the original, his mouth was closed. The first thing I wanted to do was move the mesh around to get the general shape and cut out the space for his mouth. I then adjusted the eyes and the eyelids so that I could start thinking about proportions as I worked on the mouth and the head shape. Once I was happy with the general shape, I added some placeholders for the gum line. I wasn't going for perfection here. I still was working on the overall shapes and proportions, but I wanted a placeholder there for reference. When everything got close to what I wanted, I then started to work on refining the areas of the mesh based on the references, starting with the nose and lips around the gum line. I also would check different angles to make sure that the model was coming together from all sides. Next, I started to bring in some cubes for placeholders for the teeth, subdividing them a few times to give them a little more geometry for when I sculpted them later. I also changed the shape of each for some variation between each tooth. I then remeshed the gums and started to sculpt some details. I mainly used the blob, inflate, and grab brushes for this. I just started really recently using the blob brush. It's really good for creating organic, blobby texture looks like this. After all of the teeth were in and the gums had some details, I refined the head a bit more, adding more creases and working on the ears. I took a break and then came back the next day, and I noticed I really didn't like the mouth shape. I didn't think it was open far enough, so I spent a little time adjusting the mouth shape, moving the gums and the teeth around, and then I started to sculpt the details into the teeth. The first couple of teeth weren't as good as what I envisioned, so I experimented with a few brushes and found a good brush on Blender Kit that gave me the texture that I was looking for. I then went from tooth to tooth remeshing, cutting out parts of some of the meshes, and then adding details to give it the look that I was going for. Once my model was complete, I moved on to texturing. Lately, I've been setting my models using UDEMs, which I use UV Packmaster for. So when I sculpt my models, I retopologize with Quad Remesher and then use the Smart UV Unwrap. I then apply the materials to every object, name those materials, and then I'll use UV Packmaster to create the UDEMs based on each material slot. Once the UDEMs are created, I delete all my texture slots and apply one new material and rename it something like Ren Materials. Then I'll export that FBX to Substance Painter. Inside Substance Painter, I'll bake all of the maps, and then I'll start with the stylized filter applied to all of the UDEM tiles and make sure that the normals are turned on. The filter has several different base presets that give it different types of stylized painterly looks, so I adjust it to the look that I'm going for, and then I'll build from there. I'll go through each UDEM tile and add the base colors for each section or element of my model, and I'll put those each in a folder and label them so I can reference them quickly later. And then I'll go through each of those folders and add paint layers and start to add hand-painted layers on top of that. For this project, I also used some masking and generators to add some more grit and grime to parts like the teeth for a more randomized look. Then once all those textures are done, I'll export them out with my UDEM settings and bring them into Blender and apply them to my character. I then set up my lighting. I pretty much just use the same background in HDRI across most projects, and then I'll add area lights to light the model how I want. Finally, with the animation, I wanted to do something I've never really done before, which was use the lattice modifier. And I wanted the animation to be a simple loop and make it look like he was taking deep breaths in and out. So my frame rate was 24, so I went for a 2-second loop, setting my loop at 48 frames. Once I adjusted some different points on my lattice modifier, I keyframed the strength of that to make it look like he was doing that breathing motion. And then within the graph editor, I set my cycle modifier so that it would loop. And for the saliva that was coming out of his mouth, I added some shape keys. So I had my original position, and then I added some shape keys to make it look like it was dripping down out of his mouth. And I used keyframes to animate that. This took me a little while to get right, and if I had to do it again, I probably would have also just used the lattice modifier, but I was happy with the results. Once I'm done with that, I exported out 4 different camera views, threw it into After Effects, did some color grading, and added a few effects, and that was it. So that's pretty much how I made this video. I hope you enjoyed it and picked up something from it. You can check me out. My portfolio is reggieperryjr.com, and you can connect with me on Instagram or Threads at NobodyFamous.